Andrew Jackson is the only American president who set out to destroy the nation's central bank and succeeded. On the 10th of July, 1832, he returned a single bill to Congress unsigned, and with that veto, he killed the second bank of the United States, an institution so large that the country would not build another for more than 75 years. He called it a monster. In private, to his trusted lieutenant Martin Van Buren, he was blunter still. "The bank," he said, "is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." The thing he destroyed was not small. The Second Bank of the United States held $35 million in capital, 3.5 times the size of the bank that had come before it. It operated 25 branch offices from New England to New Orleans. It made about 1/5 of all the loans in the country and held roughly 1/3 of the entire banking system's deposits, along with somewhere between 1/3 and 40% of the nation's stock of gold and silver, and it printed the most trusted paper money in the Republic. It was, in its day, the largest corporation in the United States, run from a marble Greek temple on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. And a Tennessee general who distrusted paper money on principle had decided, years before he ever reached Washington, that it had to die. What followed was a war. Not a war of armies, but a 4-year contest between a president in the White House and a banker in a Philadelphia counting house, fought with vetoes and pamphlets and newspaper cartoons, and, in the end, with the deliberate wrecking of the American economy. On one side stood Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, who believed the bank was a nest of privilege that answered to no one and to foreign money besides. On the other stood Nicholas Biddle, the brilliant Philadelphian who ran the institution and was convinced that the general in the White House understood nothing of credit, currency, or the machinery that held a national economy together. It ended with the most powerful financial institution in the United States lying dead, and the man who ran it disgraced, indicted, and buried with his reputation in ruins. Along the way, the fight censured a sitting president, cost him 2 Treasury secretaries, and called a new political party into being. It was the central struggle of Andrew Jackson's presidency, and the legend that grew up around it, first told years after his death, held that when the old general was asked what service he counted greatest, he answered with 4 words: "I killed the bank." Whether he ever said it, he believed it to the end. But the victory carried a cost the general did not live to see. When the second bank's doors finally closed in 1836, the United States was left with no central bank at all. No institution stood ready to steady the currency, to discipline reckless lending, or to halt a run before it became a collapse. And so the country would remain, through the long depression that began the year Jackson left office, through the crashes of 1857 and 1873, through the panic of 1893, and finally through the panic of 1907 that frightened the men of Wall Street badly enough to act. Crisis after crisis, for the better part of a century, the American economy rode out its storms with no hand on the wheel. The men who at last built a replacement gathered in secret on Jekyll Island, a private retreat off the coast of Georgia, in the late autumn of 1910, and the institution they designed there, the Federal Reserve, was in large part an answer to a problem that Andrew Jackson had set in motion. This is the story of how the problem began. Before the story begins, a word from me to those of you watching. This account exists because someone asked for it. It was requested by viewers of another investigation on this channel, the story of Jekyll Island, who wanted to know how the country ever reached that island with no central bank to begin with. That is how this channel works. The empires walked through here are often the ones you name. So, before we return to 1832, tell me whose empire should be next. Name the dynasty whose fortune you have always wondered about, the company town nobody speaks of anymore, the American family that rose too high and fell too hard, the estate or the boom town or the buried scandal you believe deserves a full accounting. Write it in the comments. The most requested subjects become the next investigations, and the story you name tonight may be the one that opens this channel a month from now. This story does not begin with the veto. It begins a generation earlier with two banks, two secretaries of the Treasury, and an argument over the Constitution that had already split an American president's cabinet before Andrew Jackson ever cast a vote. The argument was older than Andrew Jackson's presidency by 40 years, and it began in the cabinet of George Washington. In the first years of the new republic, the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, proposed that the United States charter a national bank. He had studied the Bank of England, and he believed a young nation drowning in Revolutionary War debt needed a central institution to hold the government's money, steady its credit, and give it a currency that would be trusted from Georgia to New Hampshire. The Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, was appalled. A national bank, Jefferson warned, would breed a financial aristocracy of merchants and speculators at the expense of the farmer and the planter, and worse, the Constitution nowhere granted the federal government the power to charter a corporation at all. Beside Jefferson stood a young Virginia congressman named James Madison, who rose in the House to argue that the bank was plainly unconstitutional. Washington, caught between his two most brilliant advisers, asked each for a written opinion and then sided with Hamilton. In February of 1791, he signed the Bank of the United States into law with a 20-year charter. It opened in Philadelphia that December, capitalized at $10 million, of which the federal government held 1/5. It was, at a stroke, the largest corporation in the country, and its sale of shares was the largest public offering the young nation had ever seen. Much of the stock was bought by foreigners, a fact that unsettled a great many Americans, even though foreign holders were forbidden to vote their shares. The two objections that would one day fill Andrew Jackson's veto message, a bank that served the wealthy and a bank owned in part from abroad, were present at the creation. For 20 years, the First Bank of the United States did its work quietly and well. The economy generally prospered, but when the charter came up for renewal in 1811, the political ground had shifted beneath it. The Federalists who had built the bank were a spent force, and the Democratic Republicans who now controlled Washington had inherited Jefferson's suspicion of it. The vote was as close as a vote can be. In the House, renewal failed by a single ballot. In the Senate, the chamber deadlocked 17-17, and the tie fell to the Vice President George Clinton of New York to break. Clinton cast his vote against his own administration's bank. The charter was allowed to expire, and the First Bank of the United States sold off its branches and ceased to exist. The timing could hardly have been worse. The following year, the United States declared war on Great Britain, the one nation on earth then capable of invading it, and did so with no national bank to finance the fight. The results were close to catastrophic. Under the British blockade, American exports, which had topped $100 million before the trade embargoes of the previous decade, collapsed to about $7 million by 1814. The government, with no central institution to help it borrow, struggled to fund the war and watched the national debt swell from around $45 million in 1811 to more than $127 million by the war's end. With no bank to discipline them, the number of state banks more than doubled, and in 1814 many of them stopped redeeming their notes in gold and silver altogether. The currency of the United States fractured into a confusion of paper of uncertain worth. The men who had killed the bank on principle had handed the country a lesson in what its absence cost. The lesson was learned, at least for a season. In 1816, a chastened Congress chartered a second national bank, larger than the first, and the man who signed it into law was President James Madison, the same James Madison who, as a young congressman a quarter of a century earlier, had risen to denounce the first as unconstitutional. Necessity, he had concluded, outweighed the scruple. The Second Bank of the United States was born, in the words of one historian, out of the very administration that had killed its predecessor. Alexander Dallas, Madison's Treasury Secretary, drew up its charter with the help of a young South Carolina congressman named John Caldwell Calhoun, a man who would spend the rest of his long career changing his mind about almost everything, including this. So the institution Andrew Jackson would one day call a monster was not some Federalist relic imposed on an unwilling people. It was the considered creation of Jefferson's own heirs, built by the party of the common man, because the alternative had proven worse. That irony would be lost on Jackson entirely. He arrived in Washington with a grievance against banks that was older and more personal than any argument over the Constitution, and it had been earned, as such grievances often are, the hard way. Long before he ever saw the Greek temple on Chestnut Street, a land deal gone wrong on the Tennessee frontier had taught the future president to hate paper money in his bones. In 1795, Andrew Jackson was 28 years old, a frontier lawyer and land speculator in the raw new country of Middle Tennessee, and he made the mistake that would shape the rest of his life. He sold 68,000 acres of land to a speculator named David Allison and took in payment Allison's promissory notes. Jackson then used those notes, as good as cash in the frontier economy, to buy supplies from Philadelphia merchants for a trading post he meant to open. It was an ordinary transaction for the time and place. Money was scarce on the frontier, hard coin scarcer still, and men did business with paper promises passed hand to hand. Then, in 1797, David Allison went bankrupt, and his paper turned to nothing in Jackson's hands. Jackson was suddenly liable for debts he had believed already settled, secured by notes now worth less than the ink on them. It would take him roughly 15 years to work his way clear of the wreckage. He kept his lands and his name, but he never forgot the lesson, and he drew from it a conviction that hardened into something close to religion. Paper money was a fraud waiting to happen. Debt was a trap. Credit was a rope a man handed his neighbor to hang himself with. Only gold and silver, coin a man could bite and weigh and bury, were real. Everything else was a promise, and promises, Andrew Jackson had learned, were broken. He carried that conviction into a career that made him the most famous man in America. On the 8th of January, 1815, at the edge of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson and a ragged army of regulars, militia, free men of color, Choctaw fighters, and Baratarian pirates shattered a veteran British force in a battle that left the field strewn with the enemy's dead, and Jackson's line very nearly untouched. The victory came, unknown to the men who fought it, 2 weeks after a peace treaty had already been signed across the Atlantic. It changed nothing about the war and everything about the country. Overnight, Andrew Jackson became Old Hickory, the hero of New Orleans, the general who had humbled the British a second time. A grateful and insecure young republic had found the warrior savior it had been looking for. The nation that cheered him was, in matters of money, a chaos. The federal government coined only a limited supply of hard money and printed no paper of its own at all. The currency that Americans actually carried in their pockets was issued by hundreds of private state-chartered banks, more than 300 of them by the end of the 1820s. Each printed its own notes, promises to pay in gold or silver that were backed by whatever specie the bank happened to hold, and that fluctuated wildly in value the farther they traveled from the bank that issued them. A note from a sound bank in Boston might pass at face value. A note from a shaky bank in the Western Territories might be worth 80 cents on the dollar, or 50 or nothing, if the bank had failed since the note was printed. Into this confusion, the Second Bank of the United States imposed a measure of order, and it did so by holding the discipline over the smaller banks that they most resented. To a man who believed only in coin, however, the entire edifice of paper and credit was suspect, and the great bank that presided over it was suspect most of all. Jackson lost the presidency once before he won it. In 1824, he took more popular votes and more electoral votes than any other candidate, only to see the election thrown into the House of Representatives and awarded to John Quincy Adams in what Jackson and his followers would forever call the corrupt bargain. The grievance fed a movement. 4 years later, in 1828, Jackson swept back with 56% of the popular vote and a commanding majority in the Electoral College, carried into office on a tide of resentment against the political and financial elites who, his supporters believed, had cheated him and cheated the common man alongside him. He arrived in Washington as the self-made people's champion, and he arrived with the Second Bank of the United States already fixed in his mind as an enemy. He did not wait long to say so. In his very first annual message to Congress in December of 1829, 7 years before the bank's charter was even due to expire, Jackson raised the question of its future without being asked. He doubted, he told the Congress, that the bank was constitutional, and he doubted that it had succeeded in giving the country the sound and uniform currency it had promised. It was a shot fired across the bow of the most powerful financial institution in the country, and it was heard clearly in a marble building on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, where a proud and brilliant man had spent the better part of a decade making that institution the envy of the financial world. His name was Nicholas Biddle, and he did not yet understand that the old general meant every word. The building itself made the argument. On Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, between 4th and 5th, stood a temple. Its architect had modeled it on the Parthenon, and it wore the same cold marble authority, a row of Doric columns rising above the paving stones of a commercial street, promising permanence to a young country that had very little of it. Inside this Greek temple sat the Second Bank of the United States, and it governed the flow of money through a continent. What it did, no American institution had ever done at such scale. It held the deposits of the federal government, collected the government's revenue, paid the government's bills, and serviced the national debt. It moved money across a vast and roadless country, redeeming a note issued in New Orleans at a branch in Boston, giving the United States something close to a single national currency for the first time in its history. And it disciplined the hundreds of smaller state banks by the simplest and most resented means available. When the notes of a state bank accumulated in its vaults, the Second Bank would present them for redemption and demand gold or silver in return. A state bank that had printed more paper than it could back was suddenly forced to produce coin it did not have, and so, to stay solvent, it had to lend cautiously and print modestly. Nicholas Biddle described this power plainly. The bank, he wrote, could serve as a check upon the state banks to compel them to keep their issues within proper limits. To the state bankers on the receiving end, the check felt less like prudence than like a hand around the throat. The numbers were without precedent in America. The second bank held $35 million in capital, a fifth of it owned by the federal government and the rest by private stockholders. It operated 25 branches across the country. It made about a fifth of all the loans in the country, and it held roughly a third of the entire banking system's deposits and somewhere between a third and 40% of all the gold and silver in the nation. It returned a steady 7% to its shareholders year after year. It was, by common agreement, the largest corporation in the country, and it answered, in the end, not to the Congress and not to the President, but to its own board and its own president in Philadelphia. That independence had been blessed by the Supreme Court. In 1819, when the state of Maryland tried to tax the bank's Baltimore branch out of existence, the case reached the highest court in the land, and Chief Justice John Marshall handed down one of the foundational rulings of American law. In McCulloch v. Maryland, the court held that Congress had the constitutional power to charter the bank, and that no state could tax an instrument of the federal government, for the power to tax, Marshall wrote, involved the power to destroy. The Second Bank of the United States thus stood on the firmest legal ground the Republic could offer. Its constitutionality had been settled by the court itself. Any president who wished to challenge it would have to challenge the Supreme Court along with it. It was, in the sober judgment of most historians who have studied it, a well-run and largely beneficial institution. It gave the country a sound currency, financed its explosive growth, and smoothed the movement of trade at home and abroad. But an institution of such reach, accountable to so few, was bound to look different depending on where a man stood. To the merchant in Philadelphia or the planter seeking a loan, it was the steady engine of American prosperity. To the state banker it restrained, the Western debtor it disciplined, and the Tennessee general who trusted only coin, it was something else. It was a concentration of private power over the public's money, unelected and nearly untouchable, and Andrew Jackson had a word for such things. He called it the monster. The monster had a keeper, and the keeper was the reason it ran so well, and in the end, the reason it fell. He was the most gifted financier the country had yet produced, and one of the vainest men in it. To understand how the bank war became a duel rather than a policy dispute, one has to understand Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle was born in 1786 into one of the first families of Philadelphia, and he was a prodigy almost from the cradle. He was admitted to the University of Pennsylvania at the age of 10. The university declined to graduate a child, so he transferred to Princeton, and at 15 he graduated at the head of his class. He was, by any measure the young republic could apply, brilliant, and he knew it. He might have been anything. He read law and practiced it. He traveled in Europe as secretary to an American minister and moved easily among the courts and salons of the Old World. He edited a Philadelphia literary journal, the Portfolio, and he took on the task of preparing for publication the journals of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, shaping the raw field notes of the Great Western Expedition into the narrative Americans would read. He collected art and sculpture and installed it at Andalusia, his columned estate on the banks of the Delaware, where he lived the life of a Philadelphia gentleman of letters. Banking was almost an afterthought for such a man, a civic duty more than a calling. It would become the thing he was remembered for, and the thing that destroyed him. He joined the board of the Second Bank as one of the directors appointed by the President of the United States, and in 1823, still in his 30s, he became the bank's president. Under the two men who preceded him, the institution had stumbled badly, nearly failing in its first years and then contracting so violently to save itself that it helped bring on the Panic of 1819. Biddle steadied it. Over the decade that followed, he made the second Bank of the United States into the disciplined, profitable, continent-spanning institution that his enemies would come to fear. Most historians credit him with running it well, and he ran it with the confidence of a man who believed correctly that he understood money better than any other person in America. That confidence was Biddle's genius and his ruin. He held in his hands the levers of the nation's credit, and he knew that a tightening here or a loosening there could quicken the economy of an entire region or slow it to a crawl. He came to regard the bank as his own instrument, played by a master, and he came to regard the men who criticized it as amateurs meddling with a machine they could not comprehend. When he considered Andrew Jackson, he saw a soldier, a duelist, a man of the frontier who knew how to win a battle and nothing whatever about currency or credit. Biddle had himself voted for Jackson in 1828, back when the bank had not yet become a matter of dispute between them. He did not regard the general as an enemy so much as an ignorant man who would, in time, be made to see reason. It was a catastrophic misreading, and it flowed directly from Biddle's vanity. He could not conceive that a backwoods general might understand the politics of the bank better than he understood the economics of it. He could not conceive of losing, and because the possibility of defeat never entered his mind, he would eventually agree to a gamble that turned a slow argument over a charter, which he was well positioned to win by patience, into a public trial of strength between the bank and the presidency, which he was almost certain to lose. The charter of the second bank did not expire until 1836. Biddle had every year between then and now to make his case, to court the Congress, to wait Jackson out. Patience was the one card he held that Jackson could not trump. He was about to be persuaded to throw it away. Two of the most powerful men in the United States Senate had a plan, and it required Nicholas Biddle to demand a decision from Andrew Jackson at the worst possible moment in the middle of an election, 4 years before he had to. They believed it would save the bank. It would kill it. The plan belonged to Henry Clay. Clay was the senator from Kentucky, the great compromiser, the most formidable orator of his generation, and in 1832 he was Andrew Jackson's opponent for the presidency. He looked at the bank's charter, which had 4 years left to run, and he saw not a financial question, but a political weapon. If Biddle applied for renewal now, in the heat of the campaign, Jackson would be caught in a trap with no good exit. Sign the recharter, and Jackson would enrage the hard-money men who formed the core of his following. Veto it, and he would appear to be destroying a sound and popular institution out of spite, handing Clay the issue he needed to win. Either way, Clay believed, the general lost. Beside Clay stood Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, the other titan of the Senate, and Webster's interest in the bank was not entirely disinterested. He defended the institution on the floor of the Senate with his celebrated eloquence, and he also drew a retainer from it, a paid relationship he saw no reason to hide. On at least one occasion he wrote to Biddle to observe that his retainer had not lately been renewed, and that if his services were still desired, the usual arrangement might be refreshed. The bank's most powerful advocate in the Congress was, quietly, on the bank's payroll. It was precisely the kind of arrangement that lent Jackson's darkest charges the ring of truth. Biddle hesitated. Some instinct told him that forcing the question early was dangerous, that Jackson's hostility was real and his following large. But Clay and Webster pressed him, and they assured him that Jackson would never dare veto the bank so close to an election. In January of 1832, Nicholas Biddle submitted his application to recharter the Second Bank of the United States 4 years before he had to. The bill included modest concessions meant to soften Jackson's objections, and it would have renewed the bank's charter well before the old one was due to lapse. It moved through the Congress on the strength of the bank's many friends. The Senate passed it 28-20. The House passed it 107-85. In the ordinary course of things, it would now go to the President for his signature. Jackson did not regard it as the ordinary course of things. He regarded it as an ambush, and it confirmed everything he already believed. Here was the bank reaching into the middle of a presidential election to force his hand, spending its money and its influence to bend the government to its will, doing in plain sight the very thing he had always accused it of doing. He was ill that spring, thin and gray, and often confined to his bed, but the fight restored him. When Martin Van Buren, his former Secretary of State and his running mate in the coming election, returned from his post in England and came to see him, he found the old general reclining, worn down by sickness, and Jackson took his hand. The bank, he told Van Buren, was trying to kill him, but he would kill it first. Here the story reaches its first genuine fork, and I would like your judgment on it, because able people have disagreed about it ever since. Consider Henry Clay's gambit from both sides before you decide. On one reading, it was shrewd. The bank was popular, its record was strong, and forcing the question during the campaign put Jackson in a genuine bind on ground Clay had chosen. On another reading, it was arrogant folly, a decision to dare the most stubborn and combative man in American public life at the exact moment his blood was up, handing him the perfect enemy for a campaign he was built to win. Weigh the two against each other and leave your verdict below. Was Clay's early recharter a clever trap that happened to fail, or the single worst political miscalculation of his long career? Whatever it was made. The bill lay on Andrew Jackson's desk, and the whole country waited to see what the old general would do with it. On the 10th of July, 1832, he told them. He told them at length, and with a fury the office had never seen. On the 10th of July, 1832, Andrew Jackson returned the recharter bill to the Senate unsigned, and with it a message that ranks among the most consequential documents any American president has ever written. Treasury official Amos Kendall and the other trusted advisers Jackson's enemies called his kitchen cabinet helped him sharpen the prose. But the governing ideas came straight from Jackson's own memoranda, and they were unmistakably his. The message did not read like a lawyer's brief. It read like a declaration of war. Jackson called the bank a monster. He called its powers not only unnecessary, but dangerous to the government and the country. And then he did something no president had done before. He denied that the bank was constitutional at all, in flat defiance of the Supreme Court, which had upheld the bank 13 years earlier in McCulloch versus Maryland. The court's opinion, Jackson argued, did not bind him. Each branch of the government, he wrote, must be guided by its own understanding of the Constitution, and the president had as much right as the justices to judge what that document permitted. It was a breathtaking assertion. A general who trusted only coin had just claimed for the presidency the authority to overrule the highest court in the land on a matter of constitutional law. The rest of the message was aimed not at the lawyers, but at the people. Jackson enumerated the foreign ownership of the bank, roughly a quarter of its stock held across the Atlantic in Britain and on the continent, and he warned that a national bank owned in part from abroad and immune from domestic taxation was a danger to American independence. If the country must have such a bank, he insisted, it should be purely American. But the true heart of the veto was its assault on privilege itself. The recharter, Jackson argued, would hand millions of dollars in guaranteed profit to a few thousand wealthy stockholders, most of them already rich, at the expense of the farmers and mechanics and laborers who would never own a share. "It is to be regretted," he wrote, "that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Government could not make men equal in talents or wealth," he allowed, "but it had no business adding artificial distinctions, granting titles and exclusive privileges, making the rich richer by act of law." There was a dry insult folded into the timing. The recharter bill had been presented to Jackson on the 4th of July, and he noted the date with grim satisfaction. The bank's friends had handed him their gift on the anniversary of American independence, and he would answer it in the spirit of the day. The message broke every precedent of the office. Before Jackson, presidents had vetoed bills only on narrow grounds, chiefly a belief that a measure was unconstitutional. Jackson vetoed the bank on grounds of policy, of justice, of the plain interest of the common man, and in doing so he transformed the veto from a rare legal check into a weapon of presidential will. The document furnished a political language that populists, progressives, New Dealers, socialists, free marketeers, and libertarians would all one day claim as their own. More than $8 million of the bank's stock held abroad, millions in profit flowing to a few thousand shareholders, one veto message contradicting one Supreme Court, and a presidency enlarged beyond anything the framers had drawn. Whatever else it was the rhetorical summit of Andrew Jackson's public life. The recharter went back to the Senate, where its supporters tried to override the veto. They could not find the two-thirds majority the Constitution required. Clay and Webster spoke for the bank with all their power, and Clay, too late, began to grasp the corner into which he had maneuvered himself. The veto stood. The second bank of the United States would not be rechartered by this Congress, and its fate would now be decided not in the marble chambers of the Capitol, but at the ballot box, in an election only months away, in which the bank had suddenly become the only issue that mattered. Jackson's enemies thought they knew how that verdict would go. They had a name for him now, a name they printed on broadsides and cartoons across the country, a name meant to destroy him. They called him King Andrew I. Out of the fight came an image that would outlive everyone in it. In a lithograph that circulated as the bank war raged, Andrew Jackson stood robed in ermine, a crown upon his head, a scepter in one hand, and a rolled veto in the other, his feet planted on a torn copy of the Constitution of the United States. King Andrew I, the caption read, born to command. It was the argument of the bank's defenders reduced to a single picture, and the argument was this: that a general who would defy the Congress and the Supreme Court in one stroke, who would veto a law not because it was unconstitutional, but because he disliked it, was no longer a president at all. He was a king, and a king was the one thing Americans had fought a revolution to be rid of. Henry Clay staked his campaign of 1832 on that idea. He had engineered the whole confrontation to make the bank the central question of the election, and now he had his wish. The veto was the issue. Clay's men circulated the veto message itself, thousands of copies of it, convinced that once ordinary Americans read Jackson's radical doctrine, they would recoil from it. It was a serious misjudgment of the country. The farmers and mechanics and small men whom Jackson claimed to champion did not read the veto and see a tyrant trampling the Constitution. They read it and saw a president who had told the rich and the foreign and the privileged that the government of the United States was not theirs to buy. The election was not close. When the returns came in, Andrew Jackson had crushed Henry Clay by 219 electoral votes to 49, better than 4-1, carrying most of the states of the Union and something over half the popular vote in a field of 4 candidates. The man his enemies had painted as a despot had just won one of the most decisive re-elections in the young country's history, and he had won it on the very issue they had chosen. Clay had bet the presidency that the American people would defend the bank. The American people had answered him. Out of that defeat, a new party would be born. The coalition of men who feared Jackson's expanding power, old national Republicans, disaffected Democrats, and others besides, needed a banner to gather under, and within 2 years they found one. They called themselves Whigs, after the British party that had opposed the tyranny of kings, and the name carried the whole of their case against the president in a single word. If Jackson was King Andrew, they were the Whigs who would resist him. The second American party system, Democrats against Whigs, was forged in the fire of the Bank War, and it would shape the politics of the nation for the next 20 years. Here is the question the whole story turns on, and I would like to know where you come down on it, because Americans have been arguing about it for nearly 2 centuries. To one side, Andrew Jackson was exactly what the cartoon called him, a president who tore up a Supreme Court ruling, enlarged his own office beyond its constitutional bounds, and wrecked a sound institution to feed his own grievance and his own power. To the other side, he was the last thing standing between an ordinary citizen and a plutocracy, the one man with the nerve to tell a private empire over the public's money that it would not be permitted to rule. Both cases are made from the same facts. Tell me in the comments which Andrew Jackson you see when you look at the record, the king or the champion, and say what it is in the story that decided you. Jackson himself had no doubt. He read his landslide as something more than a victory. He read it as a command from the American people to finish what the veto had begun. The bank's charter still had nearly 4 years to run, and its doors were still open on Chestnut Street. That, to Andrew Jackson, was 4 years too long. He did not intend to wait for the charter to expire. He intended to reach into the bank and pull its lifeblood out while it still lived, and to do it, he was about to break his own cabinet apart. The plan was simple and merciless. The government kept its money in the Second Bank of the United States, and that money was the bank's lifeblood, the great pool of federal deposits on which it built its loans and its power. Jackson meant to drain the pool. He would stop placing new government revenue in the bank and would instead spend down the balances already there to pay the government's bills, so that the deposits dwindled month by month while the charter still had years to run. The federal money would go instead into a scattering of favored state banks. Jackson's enemies gave those banks a name that stuck. They called them the pet banks. There was a problem. Under the bank's charter, the power to remove the federal deposits belonged not to the president, but to the Secretary of the Treasury, who was required to give Congress his reasons for doing so. Jackson could order it. Only his Treasury Secretary could execute it, and his Treasury Secretary would not. What followed was a slow revolt inside Jackson's own cabinet, and it cost 2 men their offices. His Treasury Secretary, Lewis McLean, was a friend of the bank and would not issue the order, so Jackson moved him out to the State Department and put in his place a Pennsylvanian named William John Duane, expecting a critic of the bank to do the deed gladly. To Jackson's astonishment, Duane refused. He thought the removal reckless and possibly illegal, and when Jackson pressed him, Duane would neither carry out the order nor resign his post. Jackson read to his assembled cabinet a paper taking the entire responsibility onto himself. Duane remained unmoved. On the 23rd of September, 1833, Andrew Jackson dismissed his own Treasury Secretary and installed in his place a man who would not flinch. His name was Roger Brooke Taney, and he may have hated the bank more than Jackson did. Within days, Taney gave the order. The deposits began to flow out of Chestnut Street and into the pet banks, and the Second Bank of the United States began to die. The Senate answered with a punishment it had never before inflicted on a president and has never inflicted since. Led by Henry Clay, and joined by Webster and by Calhoun, who had by now broken with Jackson entirely, the Senate on the 28th of March, 1834, formally censured the President of the United States. The resolution charged that Jackson had assumed authority and power not conferred by the Constitution and laws, but in derogation of both. The country, Clay warned in the debate, was in the midst of a revolution that was carrying it toward the concentration of all power in the hands of one man. Jackson, unrepentant, sent the Senate a written protest and went on doing exactly as he pleased. To this day, Andrew Jackson is the only American president the Senate has ever censured. The Senate was not finished. When Jackson's recess appointment of Taney came up for confirmation, the Senate rejected him, making Roger Taney the first cabinet nominee in the nation's history to be refused by that body. It was a stinging rebuke, and it did not matter in the slightest. The deposits were gone, the bank was dying, and the censure itself would not even survive. 3 years later, in January of 1837, with Jackson's Democrats returned to control of the Senate and the old General Weeks from retirement, his loyal ally, Thomas Hart Benton, at last carried a resolution to expunge the censure from the record. The Whigs protested bitterly, but they could not stop it. The clerk took up his pen, drew heavy black lines around the words of condemnation in the Senate's own journal, and wrote across them that they were expunged by order of the Senate, where they can still be seen today. There was one final turn, and it was the sharpest of all. The man who had executed the removal of the deposits, Roger Taney, the loyal instrument of Jackson's war on the bank, would be rewarded beyond any office in the cabinet. When Chief Justice John Marshall died in 1835, Andrew Jackson named Roger Taney to succeed him, and the following year the Senate confirmed him. The author of McCulloch v. Maryland, the decision that had declared the bank constitutional and that Jackson's veto had openly defied, was replaced in his own chair by the very man who had helped Jackson defy it. The bank had been beaten with every weapon the presidency possessed, but it was not yet dead, and its keeper had one weapon of his own left to fire. Nicholas Biddle was about to turn the bank's power against the country itself. Nicholas Biddle had one card left, and it was a terrible one. With the federal deposits draining away, the bank did need to pull in its lending to protect its reserves, and no one could have faulted a prudent contraction. But Biddle went far beyond prudence. He resolved to tighten credit across the entire country, sharply and deliberately, calling in loans and refusing new ones, choking the flow of money through every branch of the largest financial institution in America. He would make the country feel the loss of the bank in its empty pockets and its shuttered shops. He would manufacture a depression, and he would blame it on Andrew Jackson. He said so plainly in a letter that survives to indict him. Writing to a business associate in January of 1834, Biddle explained his reasoning without apology. The bonds of party loyalty, he wrote, could be broken only by the actual conviction of hardship in the community. Nothing but the evidence of suffering abroad will produce any effect in Congress. He believed that when enough men were ruined, enough shops closed, enough families thrown out of work, The country would rise up and demand that Jackson restore the deposits and recharter the bank to make the pain stop. He was prepared to inflict that suffering on purpose, as a demonstration, and he was confident it would work. For a time, it seemed to. As credit tightened through the winter of 1833 and into 1834, the country slid into a sharp and frightening recession. Businesses failed. Men lost their work. Interest rates climbed and money grew scarce, and the distress was real and widespread. Delegations of ruined merchants traveled to Washington to beg the president for relief, and Jackson met them with a cold and perfect answer. He had not caused their troubles, he told them. Biddle had. If they wanted the money loosened, they should go to Philadelphia and ask the man who had locked it up. The men took his advice and called on Nicholas Biddle and found him, as it happened, out of town. The scale of the distress was its own argument, and it argued against the bank. Businesses shuttered across the commercial centers of the East, and the Congress was flooded with petitions and memorials pleading for the deposits to be restored. Unemployment spread, prices lurched, and the country endured one of the sharpest bursts of financial pain in its short history. Yet the number of state banks was climbing even so, from 329 in 1830 toward the more than 700 it would reach by 1836, a swelling tide of unregulated paper that the dying national bank could no longer discipline. The figures told two stories at once. They measured the misery Biddle had inflicted, and they measured the flood he had lost the power to hold back. And then the strategy collapsed in Biddle's hands, for the simplest of reasons. He had set out to prove that the country could not live without the bank. Instead, he proved that the bank could not be trusted to live within the country. Every ruined merchant, every shuttered shop, every family thrown into want was evidence not that the bank was indispensable, but that it was dangerous, that a single unelected man in Philadelphia could reach out and darken the economic life of a continent to serve his own institution. It was precisely the charge Jackson had leveled in the veto. Now Biddle was proving it true with his own hands. By the spring of 1834, the backlash had turned against him. His own supporters, alarmed at what he was doing to the country and to their cause, pressed him to stop. In July, the bank's own board of directors voted unanimously to end the curtailments. Biddle relented. He had secured neither the deposits nor the recharter, and he had squandered the last of the public sympathy the bank possessed. His chances of survival were finished. The war was effectively over, though the bank would linger 2 more years. Its federal charter was running down toward its expiration in 1836, and Andrew Jackson, hard money in his heart, was already planning what would come after, a country of gold and silver coin, purged of the great paper monster at last. He would get the country he wanted. He would not get the one he imagined. The bank was dying on schedule. The reckoning it left behind was only beginning. The Second Bank of the United States died for the first time in 1836, when its federal charter quietly expired. It did not die all at once. 2 weeks before the charter ran out, the legislature of Pennsylvania threw the institution a lifeline, granting it a state charter and allowing Nicholas Biddle to carry on in the same marble temple under a new name, the Bank of the United States of Pennsylvania. It was the same building, the same president, the same vaults. But it was no longer the nation's bank. It was merely a large state bank in Philadelphia, stripped of the federal deposits, stripped of the power to discipline its rivals, stripped of the authority that had made it a monster. The thing Andrew Jackson had set out to kill was, in every way that mattered, dead. Jackson savored the victory, and he crowned it with an achievement no president before or since has matched. In January of 1835, the government of the United States paid off the last of its national debt. The country owed nothing to anyone. The debt that had burdened the Republic since the Revolution, that had peaked at $127 million in the exhaustion following the War of 1812, was gone, extinguished, reduced to zero. For one strange and singular moment in its history, the United States was entirely free of debt, and the old general who hated owing money had made it so. But a government free of debt, collecting more revenue than it spent, faced a problem it had never faced before. The money piled up. It piled up largely from the sale of public land in the West, an orgy of land speculation that the bank was no longer there to restrain, in which some 63 million acres of the public domain passed into private hands during Jackson's presidency. The federal surplus swelled, and in 1836 the Congress resolved to hand it back. Roughly $30 million was to be distributed among the states, deposited into the same state banks that Jackson had made the keepers of the public money. The pet banks, swollen with federal deposits, and now with the federal surplus besides, poured the money into still more land, still more speculation, still more paper. The very hard money president who trusted only coin had, by killing the bank, unleashed the wildest paper boom the country had yet seen. The dying of the second bank rearranged the map of American money. So long as the great institution had reigned from Chestnut Street, Philadelphia had been the financial capital of the United States. When the federal charter expired, that standing expired with it. The center of American finance drifted north to a narrow lane at the foot of Manhattan, where the state banks and the merchants and the speculators were gathering, and Wall Street rose in the place that Chestnut Street had held. It is a small irony of the bank war that Andrew Jackson, in destroying a Philadelphia institution he believed too powerful, helped hand its power to New York, where the money power he feared would make its permanent home. There was one more Jacksonian act to come, and it would prove the spark. In the summer of 1836, alarmed at the speculative frenzy his own policies had helped ignite, Jackson issued an order that public land could no longer be bought with paper. It would have to be paid for in gold and silver coin. The specie circular, as it was called, was the purest expression of everything Jackson believed, the demand that real money mean metal a man could weigh in his hand. It was also, coming when it did, a lit match dropped into a room full of powder. Andrew Jackson would leave office in March of 1837, handing the presidency to his loyal lieutenant Martin Van Buren, and he would leave it convinced that he had saved the Republic from the monster. Within weeks of Van Buren taking the oath, the room full of powder went up. The country was about to learn what it cost to kill a central bank. Martin Van Buren had been president for barely 2 months when the country came apart. The forces had been gathering for a year. The specie circular had driven a frantic demand for gold and silver into the West, where land buyers now needed coin the Eastern banks could not spare. The distribution of the federal surplus had pulled deposits out of one set of banks and pushed them into another, leaving both unsteady. Across the Atlantic, the Bank of England, alarmed at the gold draining out of Britain into American speculation, raised its interest rates and called its money home, and British credit, which had financed so much of the American boom, dried up. The price of cotton, the great staple on which the whole Southern economy and much of the nation's credit rested, began to fall. In May of 1837, the banks of New York City suspended payment in gold and silver. They would no longer redeem their paper notes for coin because they no longer had the coin to give. The suspension spread outward from Wall Street across the entire country within days, bank after bank slamming its window shut, and the paper money in every American's pocket lost its certain value all at once. The panic of 1837 had begun, and it did not end quickly. The figures of the ruin still have the power to shock. Of roughly 850 banks in the United States, 343 closed their doors entirely, and 62 more failed in part. By most accounts, something near 2 of every 5 banks in the country either failed outright or suspended. In the cities of the North, men were thrown out of work in enormous numbers, joblessness in New York rising by some estimates toward a quarter of the workforce, while in the South and West, the collapse of cotton and land ruined planters and farmers alike. The Depression did not lift for 6 or 7 years. It was, until the calamities of the 1890s, the worst the country had ever known, and it broke Martin Van Buren's presidency. His enemies took to calling him Martin Van Ruin, and in 1840 they turned him out of office. Andrew Jackson, retired to his plantation in Tennessee, blamed the whole disaster on the bank and on Biddle, and to the end of his days, he never doubted that killing the monster had been the great achievement of his life. Historians have argued ever since about how much of the panic he caused. His hard money policies, the specie circular, the removal of the deposits, and the reckless lending of the pet banks all played their part, as did forces far beyond any American president's control, the Bank of England, the price of cotton, the flow of silver from Mexico. What is beyond argument is the thing the panic revealed. When it came, there was no central institution left standing to soften it, to steady the currency, to halt the runs, to act as a lender of last resort. The one body that might have blunted the disaster had been destroyed 4 years before it struck. Nicholas Biddle did not escape the ruin he had done so much to bring about. From his Pennsylvania bank in the Marble Temple on Chestnut Street, he made one last grand gamble, trying to prop up the price of cotton by buying it on a massive scale with the bank's own money, hoping to restore both the staple and his own fortunes. It worked for a season and then failed catastrophically. Biddle retired in 1839, and that October the Bank of the United States of Pennsylvania suspended payment, his speculation among the ruin that dragged it down. It suspended again and in 1841 closed its doors forever. The institution that had once been the largest corporation in the United States was liquidated in a wreckage of lawsuits. Its second death was uglier than its first. Biddle himself was arrested and charged with fraud in 1841. The charges were eventually dismissed, but the brilliant prodigy who had graduated Princeton at 15 and made himself the master of the nation's money did not recover from the disgrace. He died in 1844 at his columned estate on the Delaware, his fortune diminished and his name a byword for ruin. He was 58 years old. The duel with Andrew Jackson had destroyed them both, as adversaries destroy each other, and it had cost the country its central bank. The question that remained was how long the country would go without one, and the answer would be measured not in years, but in generations. The answer was 77 years. From the moment the Second Bank's federal charter expired in 1836 until the moment a new institution was signed into law in 1913, the United States had no central bank at all. It was the richest and fastest-growing country on earth, and it ran its money the way a frontier settlement runs its affairs, on a patchwork of state banks and private notes and hope, with no hand at the center to steady it when the storms came. And the storms came again and again with a terrible regularity. They arrived roughly once a generation, and each one followed the pattern of 1837. There was the panic of 1857, which threw the banks and the railroads into ruin on the eve of the Civil War. There was the panic of 1873, which opened a depression so long and grinding that contemporaries called it the Great Depression, until a worse one claimed the name. There was the Panic of 1893, the most severe the country had yet endured, which shuttered hundreds of banks and threw millions out of work. Each time, the same thing was missing. There was no lender of last resort, no institution large enough and steady enough to stand behind the banking system when confidence failed, to lend when no one else would, to stop a panic before it fed on itself. Every crisis had to burn itself out, and the people caught in the fire simply endured it. Then came the Panic of 1907, and it was answered not by an institution, but by a man. When the banks of New York began to fail that autumn, it was the aging private financier John Pierpont Morgan who summoned the bankers to his library, locked them in, and organized a rescue out of his own resources and his own authority, acting, in effect, as a one-man central bank. It worked. It also terrified the men who watched it. The stability of the largest economy on earth had come to depend on the private will of a single banker in his 70s, and everyone understood that he would not live forever. The country had spent 3/4 of a century proving, panic by panic, exactly what Alexander Hamilton had argued and Andrew Jackson had denied, that a modern economy needs a central institution to manage its money. And so, in the autumn of 1910, 6 men boarded a private rail car under conditions of great secrecy and traveled to a hunting retreat on Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia, to design the institution the country had lacked since Jackson destroyed it. What they drafted there became, after 3 years of political struggle, the Federal Reserve Act, signed into law in December of 1913. Those who have followed this channel to the account of that island already know the rest of that story. What that account did not tell was where the problem came from. It came from here. It came from a marble temple on Chestnut Street and an old general who called it a monster. To those of you who arrived tonight from the story of Jekyll Island, I want to close the circle with you directly. You asked, many of you, how the country reached 1913 with no central bank in the first place. And now you have the answer. The whole long road from Jackson's veto to Morgan's library. Tell me in the comments whether knowing this prequel changes how you see what those 6 men did on that island. Say whether it makes their secrecy look more sinister to you or more understandable now that you know the 77 years of panic that drove them to it. There is a final symmetry worth naming because the men who built the Federal Reserve had studied the fate of the bank Jackson killed. They did not want another second bank, a single mighty institution in one city under one commanding president, another Biddle with the power to darken a continent. So they built something deliberately divided against itself, 12 regional reserve banks spread across the country, answerable to a board in Washington, designed above all to prevent the concentration of financial power in any one place or any one man. In that sense, the institution that fills Jackson's vacuum was shaped by Jackson's own fear. He had warned the country against a central bank. The country, having tried living without one, built the thing anyway, but built it in a form that answered his warning. The monster he had slain rose again, 77 years later, wearing armor of his own design. There is a piece of paper in nearly every American wallet that carries the last irony of the bank war, and most who carry it have never noticed. Andrew Jackson trusted only gold and silver. He believed paper money a fraud, banks a danger, and a central bank the greatest danger of them all. He spent the strength of his presidency destroying the one such institution the country possessed, and he went to his grave in 1845 convinced that killing it had been the finest thing he ever did. His portrait has looked out from the front of the $20 bill since 1928. That bill is a Federal Reserve note. It is paper money unbacked by gold, issued by a central bank, the precise combination of things Andrew Jackson hated most in the world, and his own face is the guarantee printed upon it. The man who waged war on the paper monster has spent almost a century as the paper monster's most familiar portrait. There have been long efforts to replace him on the note, and a redesign has been announced and delayed for years, so the face may yet change. The irony, however it resolves, will remain. It is the kind of ending the bank war specializes in, because almost nothing in the story came out the way the men who made it intended. Henry Clay engineered the recharter to defeat Jackson, and it re-elected him in a landslide and gave rise to the party that would spend the next 2 decades as his heir's great rival. Nicholas Biddle contracted the nation's credit to prove the bank indispensable, and proved instead that it was dangerous. Andrew Jackson destroyed a central bank to protect the common man from the money power, and left the common man to face 77 years of panic with no protection at all, while the money power moved from Chestnut Street to Wall Street and settled in for good. Each man won the battle he chose and lost the war he was actually fighting. And yet the deepest irony is the largest one, and it belongs to no single man. Jackson was wrong about the central bank, in the plain sense that the country tried to live without one and could not, and built another as soon as a great enough disaster forced its hand. But Jackson was also right about the central bank, in the sense that a single institution with unchecked power over a nation's money is a genuine danger, exactly as Biddle demonstrated when he set out to starve the country into obedience. The Federal Reserve exists because Jackson was wrong. It is decentralized, divided, and hedged against any one man's control because Jackson was right. He lost the bank war, and he lost the argument, and somehow the institution that rose from the vacuum he created carries the shape of his fear inside it still. The monster and the man who slew it are both a long time gone. The marble temple on Chestnut Street stands to this day, a custom house for the better part of a century, and a museum now, its Doric columns as cold and permanent as ever, a temple to a god the country stopped worshipping, and then, in its own way, worshipped again. The achievement was permanent, so was the cost. Before we close, a word from me to those of you who stayed to the end. This channel walks through the dark rooms of American power, the empires and institutions that shaped the country and then broke. Tell me which of the 2 men stayed with you, the old general who trusted only coin, or the brilliant banker who gambled a nation to save himself, and say what it was in the story that decided you. If the evening was worth your time, subscribe and stay, and the work will continue, one fallen empire at a time.